Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. My guest today is Patricia Hudson. Patricia is the author of Traces, which is a retelling of the Boone saga through the eyes of his wife, Rebecca, and their two daughters, Susanna and Jemima. Patricia has been a freelance writer for more than 30 years. Her writing has appeared in Country Living, Southern Living, and many other magazines. Her books include Inns of the Southern Mountains and Listen Here, Women Writing in Appalachia. Patricia will be the keynote speaker for the Kentucky State Genealogy and History Conference to be held at the Lexington Public Library's central location on August 7th and 8th. The conference will bring together historians, genealogists, and researchers to explore the rich history and genealogical heritage of Kentucky. Welcome to the podcast, Patricia.
Thank you so much, David. Thanks for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really excited today to talk to you. So to get started, for listeners who haven't had a chance to read the book, what is Traces about?
Well, Traces is a retelling of the Daniel Boone saga from the women's perspective, his wife Rebecca and their two oldest daughters, Susanna and Jemima. I chose to highlight those three women because between the three of them, had very different experiences of life on the frontier in 18th century Kentucky.
Yeah. How did you become interested in Rebecca Boone as a subject, and why was her story important to tell?
Well, I was one of those young folks who was always interested in history. And as a young girl trying to read a lot of history, it was usually the men's story. And I noticed that. And in 1996, I picked up a biography of Boone by John McFarriger, a Yale historian. And while I enjoyed the book and the stories about Daniel, I felt like the women were there in the story, but not fully there. So I wanted to know more about them, and that led to over 20 years of research.
Yeah, and it's pretty impressive, the research that you've done to retell this story. I'm interested in the title, Traces. Is it layered? Does it have a double meaning? And what were you hoping readers would take away from that?
It is a double meaning, and thank you for catching that. Not everybody does. Yeah, of course, the first road that Boone cut into Kentucky, he followed the Warrior's Path and then segued off of that to get to where Boonesboro was planted. And it was known by the travelers as Boone's Trace. So it's a play on words of a trace as a pathway through the wilderness, but also is a play on words about the fact that the women, as with so many women, there are only traces of them left in the historical record. So it serves two purposes, the title
Mhm.
does.
Yeah. You mentioned John Filson when he explored Kentucky, that he went into great detail about Boone, but I think he only made reference to, like, his wife. Is that the story where he didn't mention any of the women by name?
That's correct. That's correct. In his book that made Boone famous, Rebecca's referred to as wife twice and beloved wife once, but her name is not even recorded. Of course, not the names of the daughters were definitely not recorded. So
Mhm,
I found that frustrating because
mhm,
he interviewed Daniel extensively. He stayed with the Boones when he was working on his book, and he could have just turned around and heard Rebecca's stories if he had thought to do that. So
mhm.
what a lost bit of history that did not happen, and I wish had.
Yeah, absolutely, and that kind of leads into my next question. W Why did you choose fiction to tell the story?
Well, I had first thought I probably would have done a nonfiction book if I could have. I was a university reference librarian in my first lifetime, and then I segued into freelance writing and doing freelance research for other writers. And so that reference training has stuck to me for
Mhm,
for all of my life. But as I began to search through the records, it was pretty clear that there were gonna be big gaps in what was recorded about the women and what I could tell. And rather than let all that research go to waste, I decided I would try to write it as a novel. And I think that for so many women throughout history, historical fiction is the only way to return these women to some sort of prominence in it for modern readers, because there's just not enough in the historical record to write full length regular biographies.
Yeah, and so when you're telling a fictionalized account of a historical figure, one of the things that struck me as I was reading the book was, how do you fill in the details of everyday life? Like, how do you know how the cabin was constructed, or, these kind of things? Like, I feel like the amount of research that would have to go into that is just unbelievable.
Well, it was a challenge, but it was fun.
Uh-huh.
Having been a reference librarian, I obviously do enjoy research.
Mhm.
So there are a number of ways. Obviously, the printed biographies of Boone, I read all of those. My favorite actually is Robert Morgan's biography just called Boone. It's the most recent. But the biggest resource for anybody writing about the 18th century frontier are the papers of Lyman Draper, called the Draper manuscripts.
Mhm.
And they are now part of the Wisconsin Historical Society collection, but they're available usually at research libraries throughout our region on microfilm.
Mhm.
And I have to tell you, I hate microfilm
Mhm.
because it is so unwieldy. You scroll and you can't tell what page you're on, or it's just a very difficult medium. And most of the Draper manuscripts are either still in manuscript form in Wisconsin, or they are on microfilm. And only just a very few now have appeared online. For anybody who's interested, there was an attempt to put John MacFarrager's research notes into digital form, and you can find them online under Digitizing Daniel Boone. So the Draper manuscripts were the biggest thing, but also living history sites. I guess a lot of people may not realize that for historical reenactors, for the major sites, they have to be juried in. Somebody has to assess how accurate their clothing and their equipment and everything else
Mm.
is, right down to the buttons on their clothing. So people like that actually live this sort of lifestyle. It's what they enjoy doing, and they are a tremendous, tremendous resource. And then, honestly, YouTube is an amazing place because I found a site dedicated to 18th century. Primarily, it started, I think, 18th century cooking, but, visually, they were filming everything from, as you said, how to build a cabin, how to do a frontier lean-to in the wilderness. One episode was titled, "How to Make a Bed Out of Dead Leaves." So, I mean, it's a
Mm.
very extensive resource that way too.
Okay. The book is primarily structured around the stories of Rebecca and her daughters, Susanna and Jemima. Why did you choose this structure, and what were you hoping to accomplish?
Well, because the 3 women did have very different experiences. Rebecca's experience was, having to manage, alone for large chunks of time, which would have been extremely difficult because, of course, there was no ability to communicate, with someone in the wilderness in those days. It wasn't unusual for women to believe that they were widows even when their spouses didn't return for years at a time. If you can imagine the difficulty of that. The only thing modern I can liken that to, even just a little bit, is the what a military wife must experience, or a military husband must experience when their significant other is off and in areas that are dangerous, and they don't know when they're going to be home. For Susanna unfortunately was a victim of domestic abuse, and that's a topic that is still all too common, even these days.
Mhm.
And it was important for me to show, I think, the readers how little agency, how little control of their lives the women of that time period had. I mean, it was totally legal for a man to beat his wife, as long as he didn't permanently maim her. That was the legalese. Um, so unhappy marriages, abusive marriages, there was not really a way out. And so that was her story. And Jemima, her story, of course, was that she was the subject of the rumors that swirled around the Boone women for all of their lives, really. And the rumors came about because of Boone's fame, and then follow the women, from North Carolina to Virginia to Kentucky, and then on to Missouri. So it was a big part of their story, and how someone not only survives but kind of overcomes rumors that are unsavory.
Mm,
As many of the biographers said, the rumors might have been true, they might not have been true. There's no way we'll absolutely ever know for sure. But what
mhm.
I do know for sure is that those stories followed the women and they did have to live with them.
Yeah, and that was my next question with Jemima Boone, the speculation of who her father was, and how did you approach that in the book? And how did you, did you take dramatic license with that?
Well, what I did is, after having traced how these stories followed the women, and I went back and I tried to find where did the story originate, and I do believe I found in the documents where the story first came to be. And the story, in case listeners don't know, is that one of Rebecca's children was said to have been fathered by one of Daniel's brothers. And I went back and looked, okay, how did this get started? And then how did it progress? And the story morphed and changed. It was an interesting process to watch how what was initially said was not at all what was finally being said, years later. And it was like just this extended game of gossip. One person thinks they know the truth, and some of the resources in the Draper manuscripts, people were adamant that they knew the truth, but yet would get parts of it, you know, told in a very different way. What
Wow.
I did finally was, obviously I had to make a decision as a novelist. I'm not gonna tell everybody what I decided. They'll have
Mhm.
to read the book to find out. But I did finally compile all of my research about the rumors, and I published that in a scholarly way, not taking any dramatic license, and it's in Appalachian Journal, the fall issue of 2022, if readers or listeners are interested in finding out just the academic
Okay.
side of the story.
Okay. So many of the listeners of this podcast are genealogists. We're a library podcast.
You right?
What are some of the unique challenges and rewards of researching women ancestors in particular?
Well, any listener who is a genealogist will know the frustration of trying to find that missing link on a female line, because so often that information has been lost. Women were very often only referred to by their married name, and the frustration of that I mean, I personally have dangling branches on my family tree that I cannot fill in because I do not know the woman's, even her given name. I just know she's Mrs. Quillen or Mrs. Brown, and that's pretty much a dead end unless you can find a marriage certificate that lists their maiden name, or you can find some other documentation that allows you to connect who their birth family is. One of the things that I hope listeners, both at the conference and through this podcast, will understand is the importance of us now restoring women into history and making sure that we are keeping good records and that we are documenting. And the things that we think are just obvious, like, for example, your grandmother's name, may not be in a generation or so. It's very interesting how quickly that information is lost.
Mhm.
It doesn't take very many generations, and so I think that's important, and I really would like to believe that women are being thought about and that their histories are being recorded more, and certainly they are to a degree. But a statistic that just absolutely stunned me was a study that was done in 2020, not all that long ago,
Mhm.
indicated that in the average American history curriculum, less than 10% is about women.
Wow.
Less than 10%, and that's now, right?
Mhm.
And of that really paltry 10%, about 6% of that is, the women are mentioned only in relation to a father, a brother, a husband.
Mhm.
So there's still so little women's history being taught in our schools, and I think that's a real I think that's a real problem. There was an educational researcher named Myra Sadker, and she studied the issue of this gender imbalance in the way we teach history. She studied it for a very long time, and she summed up her conclusion by saying, "Whenever a girl opens a history book and reads a womanless history, she learns she is worth less."
Mm,
And that I think is the thing that I would very much like to see changed.
mhm. Yeah, and I think that your book is a great way to get that, to contribute to learning more of women's stories. I mean, I think you did such a great job at portraying the challenges and the difficulties. And I mean, living without your husband for months or years at a time, and the woman did everything.
Mhm.
That,
Yeah.
like, it was just like these stories are amazing of what people went through. It makes me happy that I live now. I'll be
A lot of readers do say that. Yeah, I often liken, the whole idea that the men were out doing all these amazing and dangerous things, and they were, not to take anything away from them, but the women were there too, and I liken it to the old story about Ginger Rogers and Fred Astaire. And it was, Ginger did everything Fred did, only backwards and in heels.
Yeah.
And these women did many, if not most of the things the men did, but often, very often pregnant
Mhm.
or taking care of a whole brood of young children, and so much more difficult in some ways.
Yeah, definitely. So a moment ago, you mentioned that you were a reference librarian. And in what ways did your librarian background shape your research process and your approach to writing the book?
Well, because of the reference background and as a librarian, you would know this, a reference librarian hates to have an unanswered question. It's just almost it's like fingernails on a blackboard, you gotta know, you gotta figure it out. So what happened is because of that, I wanted to stick as closely to anything that has been in the historical record, keep it as absolutely documented as possible. And it took me 20 years of research to feel like I had achieved that level to where I thought I could begin to tell the story in an honest way.
Mhm,
And of course, any historical novelist who is honest will admit that they know they didn't get every single thing right.
mhm,
But I think that the value is, like, look what we're doing today. These women are being talked about and they're being remembered, and that's what I hope this novel, will do.
mhm. And what were some of this was probably an impossible question to answer, but what were some of the surprising things you learned along the way? What stands out?
Oh gosh, so many
Yeah.
things. Uh, I guess, in this historical record, what you see is something like, they'll write down, well, it was a year and a half until there was a grist mill in this particular area. And then you
Mhm,
begin thinking, as a researcher, you begin thinking, okay, well, how did they grind their grain?
mhm,
Corn was, the life staff, the staff of life for these communities, and so in digging around, you discovered, well, they had to use what was called hominy blocks, which is a very laborious process. It's like a giant mortar and pestle, and you just have to use sheer brute strength to pound the grain into submission, and just how much labor that took. And so you find something like that out, and then as a novelist, you take that bit of information and you try to figure out how do you present that little bit of information that you found in the historical record, and how do you make that come alive for your readers. And so, in my thinking about the early settlement at Boonesboro and the fact that these hominy blocks were scattered around the settlement, I imagined Rebecca feeling as if that noise was just inescapable, and that she felt like, I think I described it as, she felt like she was living in the middle of a giant drum. And in hoping that by describing some things like that, you take what's kind of dry history or can be kind of dry history, and bring it to life. And I think that really is the value of historical fiction. Historical fiction really bridges the gap between abstract historical knowledge and lived human experience. And often those two don't meet very well, and I think historical fiction is the bridge.
Yeah, definitely. Are there any other topics you'd like to cover that I didn't ask you about?
Well, I guess one thing, for an audience of genealogists and historians and researchers
Mhm.
is really the importance of bringing women back into history, or as some people say, writing women back into history, and I like to tell this brief story from my childhood. When I was 8 years old, my parents took, me and my older brother to Colonial Williamsburg, and I was really fascinated. I became, probably stemming largely from that experience, I became a major, a history major in college in American colonial history. So, if you have children, expose them early and be aware, particularly if you have girls. I was fascinated by this giant movie in the visitor center. It was on this enormous screen, and at that time in my life, our TV was small and only in black and white, and it was just this gorgeous story. It's called Story of a Patriot. But even at 8 years old, I began to notice that the women were pretty much relegated to just waving goodbye to the men and boys as they marched off, to do great things, and that really bothered me, even at
Mhm.
the age of 8. And, later in the gift shop, I refused to try on the white ruffled mob cap, which is what women and girls wore in the 18th century. I insisted on getting a tricorn like the men wore
Mhm.
because I had discerned from that movie that those were the people that actually got to do things.
Mhm.
Now, of course, that was not true in the sense that the women were there, they were doing great things themselves, they just weren't being highlighted, and so, to me, a lot of the writing that I want to do and wanna continue to do is to help the girls out there realize that, yes, we need to be represented, and we definitely were there, and we had important stories too.
Definitely. Yeah, and I would say you do a great job at contributing to that through your novel. Do you have future research projects planned?
I am doing another forgotten woman story, not surprisingly. The manuscript's almost complete. I'll be, going to England next month to finish up some research,
Wow.
and so then we'll
Mhm.
see.
Okay.
Publishing is always it's a roll of the dice as
Uh-huh.
to what's gonna sell at any given time, but, fingers crossed, right?
Okay, Patricia Hudson, it's been wonderful talking to you, and thank you so much.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.